Hello and welcome to lesson 25 of this basic biblical Greek course. So let's take a look at an overview of the contents that we're going to be covering today. We're actually going to begin with a quick recap of the infinitive forms that we learned in the previous lesson. And then we are going to spend the bulk of today's lesson learning the uses of the infinitives. So we're going to look at adverbial and substantive uses of the infinitives and do lots of exercises together. And then we'll do our vocab for this lesson. And then when it comes to the translation work, I'm going to do things a little bit differently today. So instead of actually translating the Greek into English, we're going to practice the uses of the infinitives that we learn in this lesson. So I hope that you're ready to learn with me. If you are, let's move on together. So I'd like to begin this lesson by doing a quick recap of the forms of the infinitives using the stem lu. So at the top here, we have the present infinitive form of Amy is a nai. So let's take a look now at the various tense forms, beginning with the present infinitive. The active voice is luain. Now remember that infinitives will either end in an ain or an I. So the present active and the second aorist active infinitive forms both end in ain. So we have luain and lipain. Let's continue with the present infinitive. The middle and passive voices are both the same. So they are lues thai. And while we're talking about forms that are the same, if we look at the perfect infinitive, we see that the middle and passive forms are also the same, but we'll look at that shortly. Let's move on to the first aorist infinitive forms. The active voice is lusai. The middle voice is lusus thai. And there we see in the active and the middle voices the characteristic sigma alpha that helps us to identify the first aorist. The first passive is luthanai, and there we have the theta eta that helps us to recognize the passive voice. And then the second passive is graphanai, the second passive having the phi instead of the theta. And then the second aorist infinitive forms, we've already looked at the active voice is lipain, the middle voice is lepesthai. Remember that the endings are the same as the present infinitive forms, except that there is a stem change. And then the perfect infinitive forms, the active voice is lelukanai, and then the middle and passive voices are lelus thai. And notice there that in the perfect tense we have the reduplication, the le before lu. Good. So now that we've done the forms of the infinitives, and I hope that you have taken the time to memorize them, let's now move on to the uses of the various infinitives. So before we jump into the individual uses of the infinitives, I think it's good to take a step back and look at the big picture first. So here's an overview of the uses. Infinitives have a wide variety of uses in Greek, and we will divide them into two main categories: adverbial and substantive uses. So when we speak of adverbial uses, what we are saying there is that the infinitive will modify a verb in the sentence. And when we speak about substantive uses, what we're saying there is that the infinitive will function as a noun in the sentence. Remember that infinitives are verbal nouns. They have characteristics that are part verb and sometimes part noun. And this is where those characteristics come into play when we look at the uses of the infinitives. All right, so we have adverbial and substantive uses. Now underneath those two categories, we have subcategories or sub-uses. So we're going to look at 5 adverbial uses: the complementary, the purpose, the result, the cause, and the temporal uses. And then under the substantive uses, we're going to look at the subject, direct object, indirect discourse, and explanatory uses. So let's begin with the adverbial uses together. So the first adverbial use that we're going to look at is the complementary infinitive. This is where the infinitive completes the verbal idea of another verb. Many volitional verbs are often completed by infinitives. So examples of volitional verbs are I'm able, which is dunamai, I'm wishing, thelo, or I'm about to, melo. All right, so any verb of willing, wishing, or wanting is a volitional verb and will often be completed by an infinitive. So here's an example from Matthew 6 verse 24. The Greek reads, Udais, dunatai, dusi, kuriois, duluein. No one is able to serve 2 masters. So there we have the volitional verb dunatai, is able, and then it's completed by a complementary infinitive, duluein, to serve 2 masters. And just take note there that complementary infinitives usually come after the main verb in the sentence and are anarthrous, i.e. they have no article. Let's take a look at one more example together from Revelation 3 verse 16. The Greek reads, Hutos, hoti, kleros, kai ute, zestos ute, psuchros, melose, MSI ek tu stomatos mu. So, because you are lukewarm and neither hot nor cold, and then John writes, melo, volitional verb, I am about to, and then it's completed by a complementary infinitive, MSI, to vomit you out of my mouth. All right, so this is quite a common use of the infinitive, the complementary. Think of it completing the verbal idea of a volitional verb. Our next adverbial use is purpose. So the purpose infinitive communicates the intended result of the main verb. They usually occur after verbs of motion. For example, I am coming, I am sending, I am choosing, I am giving, etc. A purpose infinitive can be tested by adding the words in order to or for the purpose of directly in front of the infinitive. So here's an example from Matthew 5 verse 17. The Greek reads, Me, nomis ete, hoti, elthon, katalusai, ton namon. Don't assume that I came to destroy the law. So there the main verb is eilthon, which we've translated as I came, followed by the infinitive katalusai, which we've translated as to destroy. And if you're not too sure if it's a purpose infinitive communicating intended results, then we could add the words in order in front of the infinitive so that it reads, don't assume that I came in order to destroy the law or for the purpose of destroying the law. Let's now take a look at the third adverbial use, the result use of the infinitive. So this infinitive use is very similar to the purpose. However, the result infinitive indicates something that actually occurred or the consequences of the action of the main verb. So look out for the following prepositional combinations. Prepositional combinations are triggered by prepositions, as you can see here, ace plus ta, the article, so that prepositional combination plus an infinitive will more than likely suggest a result infinitive. However, this combination can also be purpose. And so purpose and result sometimes overlap between each other, and you'll have to look carefully at the context to be able to discern or distinguish the difference between the two. And the second prepositional combination is hoste plus the infinitive. A result infinitive can be translated with so that, as a result, or with the result that. So here's an example from Luke 5 verse 7. The Greek reads, Epleison amphatera ta ploia hoste buthith esthai outa. They filled both the boats so that they began to sink. So the main verb there is they filled, and then we have the preposition hoste, which we translate as so that, and then the infinitive is to sink. So the understanding here is they filled both the boats, and the result of filling the boats was that they began to sink. The next adverbial use is cause. So this infinitive use communicates the reason or ground for the action of a controlling verb. It answers the question, why? Look out for the prepositional combination, dia ta plus the infinitive. And we translate the causal infinitive as because, since, or sometimes for. So here's an example from James 4 verse 2. The Greek reads, Uk ekete dia ta me aitesthai humas. You do not have because you do not ask. So the main or controlling verb in this sentence is ekete, which we translated as have. And then you see the prepositional combination, dia ta, plus the infinitive aitesthai, which we've translated as because you do not ask. And I just want to point out there, I've underlined it, humas is functioning there as the accusative of general reference, the AGR. Remember that the AGR is the subject of the infinitive and will always be in the accusative case. So humas, which is translated as you, is functioning as the AGR or the subject of the infinitive aitesthai. I've left the temporal use of the infinitive for last because it is the most difficult. So let's work through this slowly together. So the temporal infinitive use answers when the action of the main verb took place. So when you think of temporal, think about time. The most important thing to keep in mind is that the time of the infinitive is not based on its tense form, so i.e. the present, aorist, or perfect tense forms, but on contextual factors, such as its relation to the main verb and the use of the various prepositions. So there are three temporal relationships. The first one is previous time. So here's a short summary of what we mean by previous time. This is when the action of the infinitive occurs before the action of the main verb. The second temporal relationship is contemporaneous time. This is where the action of the infinitive occurs simultaneously with the action of the main verb. And then subsequent time, or subsequent time, is when the action of the infinitive occurs after the action of the main verb. So let's take a look at each one of these temporal relationships in more detail. So let's begin with previous time. So the prepositional combination that you need to look out for is meta ta plus the infinitive. That is the clue to understanding that the writer or the author is using the infinitive to communicate previous time. And we translate the preposition meta as after, because that is what it means. So here's an example from Mark 1 verse 14. The Greek reads, Meta de ta, paradothenai ton ioanein, eilthen ha Jesus eistain Galileon. Now after John was arrested, Jesus went to Galilee. So we see we've translated meta as after. But let's make some more observations here regarding Mark 1 verse 14 and what the infinitive is communicating to us. The first thing I want to point out is that John is the subject of the infinitive, i.e. the AGR, because it is in the accusative case. Now there are two clauses in the sentence. The dependent clause, which is the action of the infinitive, and that would be John was arrested. All right, so John was arrested is the action of the infinitive, because as you can see there, the infinitive paradothenai is translated as was arrested. And that part of the sentence cannot stand by itself. It needs a dependent clause, an independent clause. So the independent clause is the action of the main verb, which in this sentence is Jesus went to Galilee. Now, let's pull this together. I don't want you to be confused. Even though we translate the preposition as after, so that's meta, the important thing to keep in mind is that the action of the infinitive occurs before the action of the main verb. So in terms of understanding what Mark is telling us here, using the infinitive, is that John was arrested. That action took place before Jesus went to Galilee, which is the action of the main verb. So let me just say that again. So Mark is telling us here that John was arrested before, all right, previous time, before Jesus went to Galilee. The second temporal relationship is contemporaneous time. So the prepositional combination that we have to look out for now is en to plus the infinitive. And we translate this preposition as while or as. So here's an example from Matthew 13 verse 4. We have en to sperein auton ha men epesen paratain hodon. As he was sowing, some seeds fell along the path. So we see the prepositional combination at the start here, en to, which we've translated as. So let's make some observations here again. To begin, he is the subject of the infinitive, the AGR, because auton is in the accusative case. We have two clauses once again, the dependent clause, which is the action of the infinitive. And in this example, it is as he was sowing. And then the independent clause, the action of the main verb, is some seeds fell along the path. So in terms of understanding what the infinitive is telling us, the important thing to keep in mind is that the action of the infinitive, which is as he was sowing, occurs simultaneously at the same time with the action of the main verb, which is some seeds fell along the path. So both these actions, as he was sowing and some seeds fell along the path, happen at the same time, simultaneously, or contemporaneous time. The third temporal relationship is subsequent time. So the prepositional combination that we have to look out for now is pro to plus the infinitive. And we translate the preposition pro as before, because that is what it means. So here's an example from John 1 verse 48. The Greek reads, Pro tu se Philippon phonesai adon se. Before Philip called you, I saw you. So you can see there that we've translated the prepositional combination pro tu as before. Philip is the subject of the infinitive, the AGR, the accusative of general reference, because it is in the accusative case. The dependent clause, the action of the infinitive in this sentence, is before Philip called you. And the independent clause, the action of the main verb, is I saw you. So don't be confused. Even though we translate the preposition pro as before, the important thing to keep in mind is that the action of the infinitive occurs after the action of the main verb. So going back to John 1 verse 48, the dependent clause before Philip called you happens after the independent clause I saw you. Before we move on to the second category, the substantive uses of the infinitive, let's recap and do a summary of the adverbial uses that we've covered so far in this lesson. So the complementary infinitive completes the verbal idea of another verb. So remember to look out for volitional verbs, which are verbs of wishing, willing, or wanting. Then the purpose infinitive communicates the intended result of the main verb. The result infinitive, which is very similar to the purpose, communicates the actual result of the main verb. The cause infinitive communicates the reason or ground for the action of the main verb, and remember, answers the question why. And then the temporal infinitive use, we have three temporal relationships. The previous time, remember to look out for the prepositional combination meta ta plus the infinitive, and the previous time is where the action of the infinitive occurs before the action of the main verb. And then the contemporaneous time, look out for the prepositional combination en to plus the infinitive, and this is where the action of the infinitive occurs simultaneously with the action of the main verb. And then the last temporal relationship, subsequent time, look out for the prepositional combination pro tu plus the infinitive. And this is where the action of the infinitive occurs after the action of the main verb. Let's now turn our attention to the substantive uses. And the first one underneath that category is the subject. This is where the infinitive functions as the subject of a finite verb. Remember, a finite verb requires a subject. It is usually translated with the English infinitive to plus the verb form. So here's an example from Philippians 1 verse 21. The Greek reads, ta zein Christos kai ta apathanein kerdos. To live is Christ and to die is gain. So here, both the infinitives, zein and apathanein, which we translate as to live and to die, are functioning as the subject, while Christ and gain are the predicate nominatives. And you might be wondering, well, how can they be predicate nominatives if there's no linking verb, no aimee verb? Well, the aimee verb is implied in this verse. Now, a very helpful tip to keep in mind is to test whether an infinitive could be the subject. Try substituting the infinitive with a noun. So for example, in the phrase, to study is important, the subject is the infinitive to study. So we could take a noun like godliness and replace the infinitive so that it reads, godliness is important. Right, so if you can take a noun and replace it with the infinitive, and that phrase or that sentence still makes sense, then more than likely the infinitive is functioning as the subject in that sentence. The second substantive use of the infinitive is a direct object. And this is where the infinitive functions as the direct object of a finite verb. It may be articular with an accompanying article, or an anarthrous without the article, but never in a prepositional phrase. And this use is rare, so the cases that do exist are exegetically significant. So here's an example from John 5 verse 26. The Greek reads, ha pater, to huio, edoken, zoen, echein, en heauto. The Father has granted to the Son to have life in himself. So this is a very interesting verse if we look at the grammar here. So John could have said, the Father has granted to the Son life in himself, because we have there zoen in the accusative case, which could have been sufficient as a direct object of the verb edoken. But we have this additional anarthrous infinitive echein, which is also functioning as the direct object of the verb edoken. All right, so this use is very rare, and so because of the addition of the infinitive, it's exegetically significant, and John is more than likely driving home a theological emphasis here, something that's very important theologically. Let's now take a look at indirect discourse. So direct discourse is when someone's words are quoted directly. So for example, I could say, I am thirsty. An indirect discourse would be, he said that he was thirsty. The quotation is in the third person, not the first person. So at this stage, you might find it helpful to think of indirect discourse as occurring after verbs of sensing, thinking, or communicating. So here's an example from Mark 12 verse 18. The Greek reads, Sadukaioi, legusin, anastasin, me enai. Sadducees say there is no resurrection. So legusin is a verb of communication, and so that is followed by an infinitive communicating indirect discourse, which in this example is enai. So a direct quotation would have been, we don't believe in the resurrection. However, Mark is reporting a third person account of what the Sadducees believe. And then the last substantive use for today is the explanatory use. This is where the infinitive further defines, clarifies, or qualifies a noun or adjective. So the first example comes from John 1 verse 12. The Greek reads, edoken, autois, exousion, tekna theu, genes thai. He gave them, exousion, the right. What type of right? And then we have a infinitive that clarifies that. The right to be children of God. Here's another example from Revelation 4 verse 11. So the Greek reads, axios, ha kurios, kai ha theos hemon, labain tain, doxon, kai tain, temein, kai tain, dunamin. You are worthy. Worthy of what? Our Lord and God, to receive the glory and the honor and the power. All right, so the explanatory infinitive will further clarify or further uh, define or qualify a noun or an adjective. So here's a summary of the substantive uses. We looked at the subject. This is where the infinitive functions as the subject or sometimes the predicate nominative of a finite verb. The direct object, the infinitive functions as the direct object of a finite verb. And remember that that use is quite rare, and so the times that it does occur, there is exegetical and sometimes even theological significance attached to it. And then we looked at indirect discourse. This is where the infinitive may express indirect discourse, which is an indirect paraphrase rather than a direct quotation of speech. And then finally, we looked at the explanatory infinitive. This is where the infinitive further defines, clarifies, or qualifies a noun or adjective. So now we've looked at the two categories, adverbial and substantive uses of the infinitive. Let's do some vocab together, and then we'll finish this lesson by practicing these infinitive uses together. So our first word for today is astheneo, which means I am weak or I am sick. Then we have grammatus ha, which means scribe. Then we have thurahe, which means door. Next we have kleio, I weep, or sometimes I cry. Then we have loipos, loipe, loipon, which has a wide semantic range of possibilities. It can mean remaining, left, rest, and when it's functioning as an adverb, it can be translated as from now on, henceforth, or finally. Then we have nikao, which means I conquer. Next we have nipto, I wash. Then we have homologeo, I confess. Then we have ute, neither nor. Then we have te, which can be translated as and, but frequently this word is not translated into English. So you've got to look at the context there and decide for yourself whether translating te will be important for the English reader to know or not. And then finally we have hoste, which means therefore or so that. Let's take a look at principal parts numbers 21, 22, and 23. Remember the tense forms for the principal parts are the present, which is the dictionary form, the future active middle, the aorist active middle, the aorist passive, the perfect active, and the perfect middle passive. Let's begin with the first one, archo, which means rule. So we have archo, arxo, erxa, ergthein, erka, and ergmai. Next we have aux arno, which means grow. I'll try my best to pronounce this one for us. So we have aux arno, aux a so, a ux a sa, a ux a thein, a ux a ka, a ux a mai. And then number 23 is afi a me, which means let go. So we have afi a me, afe so, afe ka, afe thein, afe ka, and afe o mai. Remember that when we look at principal parts, our goal is not to memorize them, but to become familiar with them so that we'll be able to become more fluent in our reading of the Greek New Testament. So we're going to do the translation work a little bit differently today. I would like to practice the uses of the infinitives and just give you an opportunity to take what you've learned in this lesson and to apply that knowledge. So I'll give you an example. I'll read the Greek. I'll then give you an English translation from some of the well-known English translations that we have around today. And then I'll give you the answer. But as I read through it, I'd like you to try and provide an answer for yourself before I give you the answer and see if you get it right. So the first example comes from Acts 1 verse 3. The Greek reads, Paristasin, heauton, zonta, meta ta, pathain, auton en palois, tekmeiriois. So the ESV translates this as, he presented himself alive to them after his suffering by many proofs. All right, so we need to ask ourselves, how is the infinitive pathain, which is translated as suffering by the ESV, how is it being used in the sentence? Are there any prepositional combinations that help us? And the answer is yes. We have meta ta. And if you remember from the lesson that we've just done, when you see meta ta plus the infinitive, this is communicating a temporal use of the infinitive, specifically previous time. So I hope that you got that correct. The answer is temporal. So you give temporal as the use, and then in brackets, what type of relationship. And the example is previous time. The second example is Luke 3:21. The Greek reads, Egeneta de en to baptis thenai hapanta ton laon. So the ESV renders this as, now when all the people were baptized. All right, so the infinitive there is baptis thenai, which is translated by the ESV as baptized. So how is that being used in this clause? Are there any prepositional combinations to help us? And the answer is yes. We have en to plus the infinitive. And that tells us that once again, this is a temporal use of the infinitive, specifically communicating contemporaneous time, where the action of the infinitive happens simultaneously with the action of the main verb. All right, so we give the answer as temporal and in brackets contemporaneous time. Our third example is Matthew 6 verse 8. The Greek reads, Oiden gar ha pater humon hon kreon ekete platu humas a tesai auton. So the ESV renders the Greek as, for your Father knows what you need before you ask him. So the infinitive in this verse is atesai. So how is that being used in this sentence? Are there any prepositional combinations to help us? And the answer once again is yes. We have pro to plus the infinitive. And so this is another temporal use of the infinitive. Specifically, this is communicating subsequent time, where the action of the infinitive happens after the action of the main verb. So the answer is temporal, subsequent time. The next example comes from 1 Timothy 2 verse 8. The Greek reads, Oiden bulamai un prasuk estai tus andras en panti topo. So the Holman's Christian Standard Bible has translated this as, therefore, I want the men in every place to pray. So the infinitive in this verse is prosukesthai. So how is that being used? So I've also highlighted the verb there, bulamai. So if you're not too sure what use it is, ask yourself what type of a verb is bulamai. And this is a volitional verb. So any verb of willing, wishing, or wanting is a volitional verb that is normally completed by a complementary infinitive. So the answer here is the infinitive prosukesthai is functioning as a complementary infinitive. Our next example is from Ephesians 6 verse 11. The Greek reads, endousaste tein panopleon tou theou pros ta dunasthai humas steinai. So the ESV renders this as, put on the full armor of God so that you may be able to stand. All right, so what is very interesting about this verse is that we have two infinitives in this sentence. So the first infinitive is dunasthai. So let's just pass that quickly. This is a present. It can be either a middle or a passive infinitive. And then the second infinitive is steinai. So this is a first aorist active infinitive. All right, so let's have a look at the uses of these two infinitives. The first one, dunasthai, and we see there that it is preceded by a prepositional combination, pros ta. So pros ta plus the infinitive helps us to see that this is going to be a purpose infinitive. Some might even argue that it's communicating result, but I'm more persuaded that Paul is here communicating the intended result, which is purpose. So the ESV has rendered this as so that you may be able to. And just to point out there that humas is functioning as the AGR, the subject of the infinitive. And dunasthai is a volitional verb. And we see there that steinai is therefore completing that volitional verb. So we have so that you may be able to stand. All right, so the first infinitive is being used to communicate purpose, and the second infinitive, steinai, is being used as a complementary infinitive. All right, so a lot going on in that one verse, but we'll move on to the next one now. The next example comes from Acts 5 verse 3. The Greek reads, Apen de ha Petros, Anania dia ti, epleirosen ha Satanas tein kardion su, psusasthai se ta pneumata hagion. The New King James Version has rendered this as, but Peter said, in inverted commas, Ananias, why has Satan filled your heart to lie to the Holy Spirit? So how is the infinitive psusasthai being used in this sentence? Well, we don't have any prepositional combinations to assist us here. So just looking at the context, we can see that Peter said, Ananias, why has Satan filled your heart? And I think we could insert there with the result, or so that you lie to the Holy Spirit. So I think that contextually, this infinitive is being used to communicate a result. Our next example is James 4 verse 2. The Greek reads, Uk ekete dia ta me, I taste thy humas. The ESV has translated this as, you do not have because you do not ask. So you should know what the use of this infinitive is, I taste thy, because we have covered this in the lesson. To help us with this, we have the prepositional combination dia ta plus the infinitive. So dia ta has been translated as because. So this shows us that the infinitive is being used to communicate cause, or more specifically the reason or the grounds for the action. The next example comes from Philippians 2 verse 13. The Greek reads, Theos gar estin ha energon en humin kai ta thelein kai ta energein hupe tes eudokias. The ESV has translated this as, for it is God who works in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure. So let's just make some observations here. First, we have a linking verb here, estin, that communicates the subject of the verse, which is it. All right, so it is the subject. Then we have the verb, the linking verb is, and that tells us that theos, which is God, is functioning as the predicate nominative. And then we have ha energon, which is a participle. We haven't learned those yet, but it's translated here as who works. And then we have this prepositional phrase, en humin, which is in you. And then kai here has been translated as both. And then we have two infinitives. The first one is ta thelein, and the second one is ta energein. And they both have the same use. And what I want to draw your attention to is the fact that they are both accompanied by Greek articles, ta, and they are both in the accusative case. So this gives us a clue and shows us that these infinitives are functioning substantively as a direct object in this verse. So Dan Wallace actually translates this phrase as, for the one producing in you both the willing and the working for his good pleasure is God, which I think is just a very alternative way to translate this verse, but helps to clarify some of the grammatical relationships that are taking place here in the Greek. Right, so the answer is direct object. Right, our last example for today comes from Revelation 2 verse 14. The Greek reads, Hos eredasken to balak balain skandalon enopion ton huion Yisrael. So this is my own rendering of this verse. Who was teaching Balak to put a stumbling block before the children of Israel? So the question again is, how is the infinitive balain, which is translated as to put, being used in this sentence? Well, yeah, we have to look at the main verb, eredasken. What type of a verb is that? Well, it's a verb of communication. And anytime you have an infinitive coming after a verb of communication, sensing, or thinking, then that infinitive is usually going to be communicating indirect discourse, which is how it is being used in this verse.